We have a diversity of knowledge here, I guess, and so let's spend a fair amount of time on a review of ASI's engagement with other initiatives and resources that are out there. There's lots of different discussions going on. Part of our work is to harmonise those discussions, make sure that they're not duplicating work and nothing falls through the cracks. So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at what's going on out there in the world and what that might deliver and how that might help this group to develop the output of its work. Okay. So what do we need? What does ASI need? It's about what we at ASI need in order for our members, certifying entity members, to demonstrate conformance with our standard. Well, we need a method for emissions reduction pathway definition that is science-based, 1.5 degree aligned, because there's a commitment from ASI to 1.5 degree. It includes all indirect and indirect emissions, but what that means is not fully clear. We'll talk about that later today. Can be implemented at entity level. It's that entity level implementation that's really important and is valid for all entities along the value chain, aluminium value chain, no matter where they are in the world, what supply chain activities are included, or whether they're a production, transformation, or industrial user member. That's the challenge. When do we need it? As soon as possible, but this group is charged with coming up with something by September of this year. What exists? What's out there in the world today? There is a 1.5 degrees Celsius global sectoral pathway that's broadly aligned with the International Energy Agency's net zero emissions scenario, which defines separate slopes for primary aluminium, recycling, and semi-fabrication. The first of those cradle to gate, the latter two gate to gate. That's the IAI's work, the International Aluminium Institute. And it's important because it flows from the IEA's whole of global economy data. So net zero is a economy-wide concept. And the allocation of emissions within that slope, that broad global economy anthropogenic emissions reduction for all of what we do when we consume and produce, live our lives, the allocation of that really needs to happen top down, and it's the IEA's allocation that the IAI has built on when defining the aluminium sector's budget going forward. So that top-down approach means that steel will be doing similar things, chemicals, shipping, not bottom-up so that we add up the emissions in order to exceed the bucket. It's top-down from the IEA's piece. Since the IAI have published, they've been working with Mission Possible Partnership, and they have produced the Aluminium Sector Transition Strategy, which is aligned with IAI, gives more detail. I've shared some of the links on that, some of the costings, some of the technological pathways and strategies undertaken. It has a slightly narrower emissions coverage, focused on primary and recycling. So some other frameworks are using combinations of IAI and MPP. Out there today, there exists a broad sectoral strategy, which includes, I would say, all of the emissions, or a very large percentage, 99% plus, or 95% plus, of emissions from bauxite mining all the way through to semis production, including auxiliary processes, including auxiliary materials. So all of the flows of coal tar pitch, sodium hydroxide production, energy, not just the generation of energy, but also the transmission of energy, the mining of the coal or the oil extraction that is required to meet demand. All of that is encompassed in the IAI's global sectoral pathway, with a Mission Possible Partnership, more detailed analysis, and some forward-looking scenarios as well. So that's what exists today. I'll talk about the details of that in a moment. What's coming? What's going to be happening in the next year? Well, we've been involved with discussions, as have many of you, and International Aluminium Institute, others, in Rocky Mountain Institute's Horizon Zero work, and that's looking to deliver by the end of this year harmonized frameworks to calculate asset and product level emissions for ore-based and scrap-based aluminium flows. And the approach they're taking is one of a fixed boundary, really at the final cast house and thence some extra piece on semis production. But with a fixed boundary, that means you can, and what that means, a fixed boundary is essentially all the emissions within that boundary are the reported number. That's okay for an entity that looks like the fixed boundary. So an integrated primary aluminium producer that kind of mirrors that fixed boundary. Well, then you have a method for delivery of the emissions. But if the entity doesn't look like that, if the entity is only part of that fixed boundary, an alumina refinery, or outside of that boundary, a post-cast house facility, how do we develop entity level methods for them? That's what we're doing today. So what's coming are going to be harmonized frameworks to calculate those asset product level emissions. That's using the IAI and MPP work. So it's basing that on the global sectoral. It's going to deliver some guidance broadly, and it's going to deliver in 2024 procurement guidance. So the kind of numbers that our industrial user entities might use, the procurement, how they use procurement to drive 1.5 degree pathway, essentially their scope 3 category 1s. That's coming this year, but even that won't deliver what we need, which is this entity level method. It's why we've started now, and we're not waiting for the delivery of RMI. Throughout all of this, we're going to need to ensure we're harmonizing, right? So we're not duplicating work, and we're not at odds with some of these other initiatives. That's part of my job at ASI to ensure that that happens. Why don't some of these other things meet our requirements? IAI, MPP, Horizon Zero. Are they science-based 1.5 degree aligned? I would say yes. They flow from the IEA's net zero scenario. There's uncertainty, yes, but it reflects the science as we have today. So I would say yes, those pieces are science-based. They are 1.5 degree aligned. Do they include all direct and indirect emissions? Well, yes, at the sector level, from bauxite mining through to semis production for IAI's 1.5 degree pathway. They don't include some of the smaller post-semis emissions. Now, just to remind people, current emissions around 1.1 gigatons from the aluminium sector, dominated by the primary aluminium production, that dominated by smelting, that dominated by electricity going into smelting. So those post-semis emissions, I would say, are marginal, but they're not included in the IAI's analysis. So we're going to have to explore what we do there, proxy data or others. So yes, emissions are all pretty much in there. The 1.1 gigatons, that 4% of global CO2 emissions, they are within those scenarios, those pathways. Are they entity level? I think I belabor the point, but I'll say again, no. That's what we need to do. Understand how we start to allocate or have methods for allocation of that big pot. Can all of these pieces be implemented without adaptation at the entity level? Well, as I said before, this Horizon Zero fixed boundary, which is essentially cradle to gates for primary, could be, that could be applied to a primary entity if the entity was scoped in the same way as the Horizon's fixed boundary. So that would work. Or if a smelter, let's say, included all of their scope 3 category 1s upstream, 1, 3 and 4s upstream, then yes, that would fit with the Horizon Zero fixed boundary. So the impression you hopefully are getting from this is that for the primary piece, cradle to gate, it's probably simpler than other bits of the value chain, and that's the bit with the most emissions. So I think this is why I'm saying adapting existing methods. No, these can't currently be implemented without adaptation at entity level, but with some adaptation, at least for primary, we may be able to. And finally, are these things valid for entities, all of entities along the value chain? No, they're not. No, they don't cover all of ASI's entities as scoped. I'll leave it for a moment there. So let's have a quick look at how we're engaging with ongoing initiatives. I won't spend actually too much time on this now because it kind of repeats what I've just been saying, and it's more for you to know that we are engaging in these different discussions, as are many other people on this call. So this slide is actually from Mission Possible Partnership, but it's a good one to kind of show what's going on in this space, and I can tell you a bit about where ASI is involved. In the Science-Based Targets Initiative, we have ASI Science-Based Targets Initiative represented within our Standards Committee, Emma Watson. We have had a bit of work with them on defining some of the issues around aluminium sector and sectoral decarbonisation approaches as it currently exists. Been some capacity issues at science-based targets. Everyone is looking for those kind of SDAs, and so the signal we've got is that aluminium isn't on the list. That may be changing, but at the moment, this is why we're doing this work, because it's not being done elsewhere. But we are engaged with science-based targets, and the hope would be, in fact, what we aim to do is that any method that we do develop here that is harmonised with MPP and II and others is available for adoption by SBTI. So what we're not looking for are different parallel work streams going off in different directions. We've been involved with the First Movers Coalition, although it's gone slightly quiet now. Technical input to the commitments that have been made there. They're more focused on those first movers rather than all entities. So the application here is limited, although I would say that the data that they're using, again, flows from IAI MPP. We're involved with the Centre for Climate Aligned Finance, which is organised under the auspices of the Rocky Mountain Institute. We've had input to the pre-working group technical materials, and now we're involved with some of the working group discussions, as are many of you on this call. That's the audience for that, is the finance sector. So while it's defining some methods for comparison of portfolios of decarbonisation that are 1.5 aligned, it doesn't quite meet the needs that we're looking for today. Its audience is the finance sector. They're very focused on primary, and the kind of methods that we need for entity level just aren't being delivered by that group. So we're involved in it, want harmonisation, but it's not going to give us what we need, this entity level pathway. And finally, on the Rocky Mountain Institute's Horizon Zero work, that's the closest to what we're doing at the moment. But as I mentioned before, with this fixed boundary, it is limited in its application without adaptation. So lots going on. We're involved in all of these discussions, as I say, as are many of you, and new stuff is emerging all the time. I have to say that all of that flows from the sector pathways from the work of IAI and MPP. So that in terms of the base scientific aluminium sector slope, really, that's all IAI MPP work. There's something in there on recycled content from the Can Manufacturers Institute. The definition of recycled content for me has meaning for the environmental burden of scrap post-consumer and pre-consumer. And if we are developing any kind of cradle to gate approach that incorporates scrap, we're going to have to ensure that we're aligned with some of these other initiatives. That's why I include that there. It's a discussion that I think does have relevance to the greenhouse gas accounting, albeit the mandate of that group is to deliver recycled content method that is kind of independent of the environmental burden. We're engaged in all those discussions, as I say, many of you are too.